What's important now, I would argue, is that the rules of the game need to be changed. The plug-in house, as we'll hear about, would technically be illegal in Boston, in a Boston backyard right now. Like with a lot of things, the zoning needs to catch up to the times. Let's talk about ADUs. Who's with me? So, I want to be clear, it's not just me and any obsession that may have taken hold. I'm here to proclaim that this trend is sweeping the nation. There's reform and innovation in Austin, Boston, Cambridge, Denver, Los Angeles, Portland, Vancouver, Washington, D.C. Statewide enabling legislation has been passed in Oregon and California. And there's a lot to like here. It's about expanding housing options with tiny houses, micro apartments, ADUs. It's fundamentally disruptive. It's exploding protocols. And I think the underlying message is housing doesn't have to be that big a deal. That is a belabored process of regulation and red tape and lengthy construction. Another way to think about it is that it's the equivalent of the electric scooter, but for housing. So following that, not every home has to be the equivalent of 3 tons of automobile on 4 tires powered by fossil fuel. For the purists among us, another way to think about it is that perhaps ADUs could become as ubiquitous as bike share. So there are terrific things happening on the design front, and that picks up on something that we all recognize is clearly happening, and that is many people have much more modest space needs. They want a roof over their heads, and all the amenities of the city are outside the front door. So it really is possible to live in 300 square feet. What's important now, I would argue, is that the rules of the game need to be changed. The plug-in house, as we'll hear about, would technically be illegal in Boston, in a Boston backyard right now. Like with a lot of things, the zoning needs to catch up to the times. The affordable housing crisis is too big to bow down to these ossified rules that have built up over the years, fueled by concerns about density, congestion, parking, and traffic. Some legitimate concerns, but some would say further fueled by NIMBYism. So there has been an unfortunate history of neighbors sort of peering out of their windows and pulling back the curtains to see if there's an extra satellite dish on the carriage house out back. But we're here to say that, as it turns out, it's really not the end of the world if a teacher rents the carriage house out back. It really isn't. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Chris.
Thank you, Anthony. Good evening, everyone. It's great to be here. So as Anthony mentioned, I'm Chris Herbert. I'm the Managing Director of the Joint Center for Housing Studies. My job is to kind of set the table for folks who are actually working on these issues by making the case for why ADUs are so important. And the Joint Center, one of the mainstays of our work is demographic analysis and looking at the future of housing demand. So to start us off, this chart shows you our projection over the next 10 years, how many households we're going to add in the country, over about 13 million we estimate, and then of those, how are they distributed by family type, household type, and by age? And so I want to draw your attention to here is these first 2 columns. So of those 13 million households we're going to add, about more than 5 million are going to be single-person households. So 40% roughly of our household growth is going to be single people living alone. Another 40% are going to be married couples with no kids, so essentially 2 people. So 80% of our household growth is 1 or 2 person households, so no need for more than 1 bedroom. And so really this really strong demand that we're going to have for housing over the next decade, 13 million is a lot of households. Huge share of that is for what would essentially mean people who need small amounts of housing. Now the other thing to note here is the shading of these give you the age distribution. And you can see that of these single person households and married with no kids, we tend to think about, oh, this is the millennial generation slower to get married, not having children. The vast majority are older households. So the dark purple part of this bar of households over 75, they're more than half of that single-person household growth, and the rest of it, most of the rest of it is 55 to 74. So a lot of this is just the aging of the baby boom generation, who are going to be in these single and two-person households. So I think there's already been mentioned among Anthony and from Jason about aging in place. And so I think one thing to keep in mind, this demand for small housing units, is that it's very much tied in with aging of the population as well. In terms of aging of the population, this is looking at where do those older households live now. And this point relates a little bit to the supply and demand for ADUs. So if you look at, this is breaking out places into high-density metro, medium-density metro, low-density metro. So basically, this side of the chart is in metropolitan areas, and this is in rural areas. But within those metro areas, 31% are in low-density parts of the metro area, and the other 18% in rural areas. So roughly half of the older population is in low-density areas. Many of these folks are in single-family housing. So when we think about that demand, single-person demand, these are not new households. These are households that either already exist or going to be widows, widowers, and the like going forward. They're living in low-density areas. They talk about wanting to age in place. There's also what I would say more of a need to age in community. So as people age, they may be in a large single-family house. They don't need that large single-family house, but they don't want to move out of their community, break those social ties and all that they know. And so we need to have more options in those communities for where these older folks are living. And so they're both where the demand is, and also they're the owners of a lot of the single-family houses and the lots. And so that also relates to the higher density areas as well, where older folks are living in a lot of them single-family houses. So again, thinking about the demand, who is it that's going to need these houses? A lot of older households. Who owns the single-family houses? And the flip side of ADUs is not just as a place for these older folks to live, but also as a source of income. And so as if we think about the financially strapped older person in retirement, how do they stay in their community? If you can create an ADU and get another revenue source, that's a way of creating stability for them in their community as well, and creating more households within that housing unit. Another big piece of the story is affordability. So we think about why do we have demand for smaller housing? In part, it's because of the fact that we're spending more and more of our income on housing. So this is a chart looking at the share of renters spending more than 30% of their income on housing over the long sweep of time. We go back to 1960, it was about, this is on the right-hand scale, about 25% of renter households were spending more than 30% of their income on housing. Fast forward to today, it's closer to 50%, half. So we've had a doubling of the share of households that are spending more than our so-called cost-burdened households. Why is that? Well, a big piece of that is incomes. So if you look at that blue line, that's saying what's the change in real median renter household income over time, adjusting for inflation. It's essentially been zero. So over 50 or 60 years, we've seen no growth in incomes among renters. So the housing affordability problem is in many respects an income problem. But it's not just an income problem, because if we look at what's happened to housing costs, they're up by 60% in real terms over that time. So it's this mismatch between incomes and costs that are creating the affordability problem. And so the question is, we have to worry about how we can affect incomes, what we can do to raise incomes, but on the housing side is how do we bring down housing costs? And one way to bring down housing costs are to build smaller housing. And so I think we have to think about the ADU, again, as a way of helping to address this gap between what people's incomes are and what housing costs, and what housing that's smaller can cost less. Last point, in terms of what we're building. Nowadays, despite the fact that we have smaller households, this is a chart showing you what's the distribution of new housing starts by size has been. The top line are houses over 1,800 square feet. And you can see during the housing boom, there was a big growth in those. There's also pretty good growth in homes under 1,800 square feet. So at the peak of the last decade, we're building about 500,000 homes under 1,800 square feet. Fast forward to today, the recovery has been weak, but all the recovery has been in larger homes. Essentially, very little has been in smaller homes. We're also not building condos, and we're not building manufactured housing. And there's a whole conversation we could have about why that is. All the development regulations, the cost of inputs, labor costs, all those things that are squeezing our ability to produce smaller housing. Again, we need to come up with a new solution. So we have many more small households, older households living in places that are low density. a need for that housing, affordability challenges. How do we bring down the cost of housing, provide these smaller housing units? ADUs. So, yes? So this chart is just for sale, because I was looking at the size of units. So it doesn't include the multifamily. You know, the size of multifamily units hasn't necessarily gotten bigger. I think the typical unit is about 1,000 square feet. The median is about 1,000 square feet. They have certainly gotten more expensive. So if you look at the median cost of median rent of a new apartment nationally is about $1,500. In Boston, Marcy, what would it be for a new multifamily building apartment? Like 3,000, 35? Yeah, a lot. I didn't mean to pop quiz. So in multifamily, we're not necessarily building larger, but we're building high-rise, we're building luxury, we're building expensive. So you know, there's certainly a need to build more affordably there as well. All right, I've taken more than my 5 minutes. Let me turn it over to Lily.
Hi, so my name is Lily Canan Reynolds. I'm a planner and the Community Engagement Manager for the City of Newton's Department of Planning and Development. So these guys set it up really nicely for the story I'm going to tell you for Newton. It's really about how we did what Anthony mentioned, sort of trying to push the boundaries of our zoning ordinance and implement and pass a new zoning ordinance in Newton so that ADUs could be allowed by right in all single and two-family dwellings. I will say, too, that my colleagues who I worked on this with, James Fries and Rachel Blattner-Carney, are very much a part of the work here, and they're in a council meeting tonight, so I'm the lucky one. So the accessory dwelling units sort of mini movement in Newton had been ongoing for several years. We actually had an existing ordinance in dating back to 1991 that had been amended a couple of times. One of the main flaws of it is that it had a very high minimum lot requirement, so essentially rendering ADUs illegal or not possible in most places with small or medium-sized lots. But in 2016, we had a strategy, a Newton housing strategy that launched, and this sort of gives you a little bit of an idea of some of the demographics for us. So we're, a suburb of Boston, largely single-family homes in our housing stock, also 2 to 3 unit buildings, some condos, and just a bit of mixed use and very little, a bit of multifamily and very little mixed use. And like many of the statistics that you just rattled off in terms of sale prices, over the years we've had drastically increasing sale prices for single-family homes. In 2016, it was 1.1 million was the median price for a single-family home. What that has meant is over time, families earning higher incomes have essentially replaced families earning lower incomes. So the figure on the left is the growth in households earning over $100,000 a year between 2000 and 2013, and the loss of families or households making $125,000 or less. So the aging in place story really is very resonant in Newton. We have generally an older demographic than some of our nearby neighbors, and this story was covered in the Boston Globe, a couple who was interested in creating a caregiver unit inside their home, but because of the previous zoning ordinance, they were not allowed to. So what they did is they actually ended up creating a living space for a caregiver in their home, which led us, hearing these stories led us to essentially call our accessory apartment ordinance a second stove ordinance, because we were finding that so many of these families or households were creating these units, but getting away or getting around the requirements of officially calling it an accessory dwelling unit, because they would have everything that would be a separate living space except for the second stove, which triggered it to be considered a separate unit. We even had reports from our inspectors who were sort of suspicious that it was clear that there had been a stove there before the inspection and probably would be there after they left, but it wasn't at the time of their inspection. So this will give you, I'll come over to the side, this will give you an idea of our zoning prior to 2017. We also had a really, for the lots that were eligible to create an accessory unit, many of them you were required to go through a special permit process, which in Newton is quite onerous. It's a city council process, there's a public hearing, your neighbors are mailed a letter inviting them to come and speak at the public hearing if they so wish. And from a staff time, it resulted in about 25 hours on average of planning staff time. Other departments get involved as well. And still only 20% of single and two-family homes in the city were eligible to get to that special permit pathway. There were also no design guidelines, and it was not allowed to have any additions or new construction, or only with special permit, and that was still with many limitations. And cut off of the screen here, the ADUs were essentially treated as a full housing unit, not as accessory to the principal dwelling unit. So we started also mapping where we were getting reports of illegal accessory apartments. And if you know Newton, you might know that the northern part of the city is historically the lower and medium income working class parts of the city, and the denser part of the city. So you'll see that this is, where most of the illegal units were being reported. Big health and safety concerns because our fire department just simply doesn't know that there's a second unit there. And this became part of the story also that we wanted to talk with our city councilors about and with our residents about why it was important for us to create a new ordinance. So one of the big changes that we made was in terms of the number of occupants that were allowed with this new ordinance. So on the left is a dwelling unit. So in our ordinance, one family and up to 3 unrelated individuals are allowed to live in a dwelling unit. With the new ordinance, and by explicitly calling out this accessory unit to be accessory to the principal dwelling unit, we just said that that's the exact same amount of people that can live in the entire principal dwelling unit and accessory unit together. We also started to look at some design guidelines, so we wanted to make sure that the accessory unit would essentially be invisible from the street. We started looking at ways for our second means of egress to be reviewed by our staff, and also ability for that to be sent to our Urban Design Commission. We now in the new ordinance have a requirement, and these actually carried over from the previous ordinance as well, that there's no separate ownership, so it's not an opportunity to subdivide your home. The property owner must live on the lot in either the accessory or the principal unit. The principal dwelling unit must be at least 4 years old. So this was a response sort of in the final stages of the ordinance drafting to concerns that this ordinance might encourage developers to sort of create a secondary unit. So we included this. There's also no short-term rentals, so a minimum amount of rental period for the accessory unit. And also that no parking is required to be built. So this was sort of for folks who are interested in sustainability, I think a win for us to make sure that no parking would be required for the additional unit. This design review criteria, as I mentioned a moment ago, and that the accessory unit would still be subject to all dimensional requirements. So essentially understanding that a homeowner could build an addition to their home within these same dimensional requirements, or they could make that as a secondary unit, as the accessory unit. So that wasn't changed with the ordinance. And for historic carriage houses, for example, then the historic body decisions still take precedence. For the internal units, these are the size restrictions, so minimum of 250 square feet, up to 1,000 square feet, or 33% of the principal dwelling, whichever is less. And for the detached, basically that upper threshold goes up to 1,200 or 40% of the principal dwelling unit. And the detached unit must meet the setback requirements of the principal dwelling unit and must be 6 feet from the principal dwelling unit. We did a bunch of GIS analysis as well to sort of estimate how many we thought could potentially, at the very upper limit, produce these units. So this is for new build detached, would be about 40% of all 1- and 2-family homes. And this is conversions of detached buildings, so those carriage houses or garages that already existed. So all of the green ones would meet the current criteria, so 805 properties. So what have we found? Similar to what our research from Portland or from places like Durango that Anthony mentioned, or places like Lexington, is that accessory dwelling units, even though they have a really strong impact on those families that do choose to create them, they're not for everyone. However, we still have seen an increase from 5 ADUs permitted in 2015 and 2016 up to 10 in 2017. And so far to date in 2018, we have 8 accessory dwelling units been permitted. Between 2005 and 2017, it's about 44. I brought copies of our ordinance, and they're in the back, so we welcome you guys to take that. Also, you can visit our website and find out more about it. We borrowed a lot of our language from Portland, so the more the merrier. And then the one last thing that I did want to just share, and maybe if folks are interested in, we can talk about later, is that we also did a lot of outreach and education and almost a coalition building throughout this. So I didn't put this in my slides, but I found this in my files today. It's sort of our mapping of which groups would be interested in working together on getting this passed. So seniors groups, environmental groups, different members of the council. So it really was sort of an effort of education and coalition building.
All right. So thanks everyone for giving some context. So I'm from the Housing Innovation Lab in Boston. I'll share with you what we've been doing with our additional dwelling unit pilot. As Chris mentioned, Boston is experiencing a gap in the middle. We've got a lot of luxury housing being built, and we have actually quite a bit of lower moderate income housing, about 20%. We never have enough. But there's this growing gap in the middle, and the Walsh administration recognized that, and they said, what can we do about this? So my team was established 3 years ago to try to figure out how can we solve this problem. And we work closely with the Newer Mechanics, which is the city's innovation team, and the Department of Neighborhood Development, which does all the housing work for our city. And we think about how can we develop, fund, and design differently. To do that, we try to work as closely as possible with residents to understand their needs and their pain points. And then we engage collaborators like the BSA as much as we can, and academic institutions a lot. And then we try to be very experimental in our approach to learn as we go. So some of the things we've been working on, compact living or allowing smaller units, intergenerational home share. So there are a lot of older adults as they age, as we've already mentioned, that have extra space in their home. So instead of building an additional dwelling unit, maybe just actually allowing someone in to rent one of the bedrooms in their house. And then housing with public assets, looking at our libraries and our fire stations and community centers and thinking about whether we can build housing above them or beside them. And then today I'm going to talk about additional dwelling units. So the way we're defining additional dwelling units right now in Boston is thinking about within the envelope of the home. We have not branched out to detached or attached units yet. So there's some pictures here that show different use cases. So the attic of a triple-decker, taking the first floor of a triple-decker and splitting it into 2 units, carving out extra space in a single family, an old Victorian that you don't need all that space, or a basement unit. There's a lot of reasons that this is important to Boston. We need more affordability. We're interested in multi-generational family arrangements, legalizing illegal units. We know there's a lot of basement apartments already in Boston, and we want to make sure that those are safe and appropriate conditions, helping people remain in their homes, and achieving our housing goals. So what are we allowing? Carve-outs, like I mentioned, attics and basements, but we're not allowing bump-outs, detached units, or attached units at this point. One of the first things that we did, we had some zoning draft language, and we came to the Boston Society of Architects and worked with Jason and his team, and we said, what do you think about these? What do other designers think about these? And we put the actual zoning code we've drafted in front of them, and they helped us see that they were definitely not right yet. I had this great quote that I heard from one of the architects in the room: limiting the exterior changes requires internal gymnastics and the cost required to do this will make the program unusable. And I was like, I think we need to do some work here. But that feedback was really instrumental in helping us change and improve those guidelines. We then went out and talked to residents who had expressed interest in their homes, looking at their actual units and thinking about how could they do this program and how would it benefit them. We turned those conversations into personas, and here's a couple examples. And then we took what we'd learned from the charrette and the personas and we put them in front of policymakers and we said, okay, if we want Elizabeth or Justin or Nancy or Robert, these hypothetical people, to be able to do this in their homes and meet our goals, we need to change the way we've drafted this language. And so we did. We changed it, and it's much improved. We now are actually allowing, as of right, a new unit in 3 neighborhoods as our pilot neighborhoods. And they don't have a lot of the zoning requirements that you would have if you wanted to do this on your own going through the variance process are no longer required in those neighborhoods. So they don't have to add parking. They can add extra floor area ratio, and a couple other things. And as Jason pointed out at the beginning, we're allowing them to change the exterior if it's to add a window or a door. So a couple details, 3 different neighborhoods, so that gives us a chance to see how this works in different places across the city. It's an 18-month pilot, so that'll give us time to iron out all the kinks. A couple qualifications: they need to be owner-occupied in one of the pilot neighborhoods, and we're allowing single families, 2 families, or 3 families to do this. And they need to follow safety and code requirements. A couple resources we're adding to try and help homeowners get through the process: a toolkit online that explains what we're trying to do, a loan program up to $30,000 for qualified applicants, and then a very efficient process, which BSA architects have also been involved in that. So we're quick eligibility check online, invite the resident to come in to meet with Inspectional Services Department and the Planning Department to actually get their code requirements answered. And hopefully, I don't know if somebody wants to fix that, and hopefully make it as efficient and effortless as possible to get them to permits. So where are we? Of the 3 pilot neighborhoods, we've had 50% of our applications from East Boston, and I think that is a lot to do with Councilor Edwards really promoting the project there and getting residents to know about it. We've had 25 applications since January, only 2 permits pulled, so we're still figuring out some of the kinks between applying and permitting. Mostly, actually, it's been very diverse across single, 2-family, and 3-family. Mostly basement applications. I think that's just an easier place to start. And then mostly new units as well, a few existing. So with that, I want to talk quickly about how we're already thinking about expanding the program. We're thinking about new neighborhoods, and we're thinking of backyard units, and the plug-in house, which I worked on with James Shen, is one of those possible expansions. So we have a little video to show you.
This is the beginning. This is like the first step for us. We've never shown the plug-in house to anyone outside of China.
Yeah, I think it's an opportunity for cities in general to get this, first step and adapt this technology, these ideas to whatever reality they're having, supporting them at the policy level.
Would you want it, and then how much would you pay to live in a plug-in house? Something like that.
Yeah.
It's only insulation. It's made out of these panels, and you put the whole thing together with an Allen key. So I guess like an IKEA product.
But I really like the look of it from the outside too. Like the dynamic angles really make it more like eye-catching. I don't know, this is affordable housing. Like as a student, it's way more appealing to me. Like I'm trying to go to college. I don't have that much money to spend. So like having this would just be great for me.
Well, it's very impressive how this house doesn't really need skilled people. I haven't had the experience of building anything before, and I've been helping in this house.
With the Housing Innovation Lab, we're doing many different prototypes and tests, all about how can we make Boston more affordable. It's because we have different neighborhoods, we have different types of people that want different things, and so we need to have a diversity of options for them. So we have initiatives like compact living that are thinking about, do people want to live smaller? And that actually can connect to the plug-in house, because you could design a small plug-in house.
I think the idea of flexibility is interesting. You know, we don't usually think of housing or buildings as flexible, but our lifestyles are flexible. So if a building could change with you, that would be really interesting. And in fact, I think, and with the plug-in house, you could definitely do things like that. So the idea behind the plug-in house is infill. There's this idea of, and hopefully that way, we could provide less expensive housing for renters. Also, the problem with cities growing outwards is you have to bring all the infrastructure out there. If you can build into existing communities, people building houses in their backyard, then you're taking advantage of all the things that are already there.
Yeah, so I guess there's a big lag with the video, but so it's, in reality it's even faster erecting the plug-in house. Yeah, definitely we should move on from there. So yes, I'm here to represent design in this discussion, and there are three ideas I'd like to touch on with my presentation here. One is how designers can help develop scalable solutions. That means we're going to try to come up with ideas of really lowering the cost of housing. The other is helping imagine possibilities for helping cities, but also homeowners and renters. And then number three, how we can be more involved with engaging stakeholders. So scaling solutions, for us, that means that we need to rethink our way of building houses. And so the plug-in house uses a panelized system. So here you essentially have no framing. So you take a wall, you have the insulation, you have the materials on the inside and outside, and you take out, there's just no framing in this. And the reason why we can do this is because these houses are actually very small. Also because of the size and the way that we've approached this sort of modular design, this allows us to mass produce these using molding technology. So instead of, if you were to go to a factory of a prefab company, oftentimes you would see really stick framing or light steel framing in a different location, right? But for us, we're actually manufacturing these more like every other product that you would see around you, and obviously there are a lot of benefits to that kind of efficiency. So this is a picture from inside the factory, also the previous one. This is our molds that we use to create these panels. So the panels are made of polyurethane insulation, so very high quality insulation that is injected into molds. The molds are adjustable, so that allows us to create a lot of flexibility in the design, so customizable designs. And also the panels allow for flexibility. So you can imagine you can add more panels for an extra room or take panels away for fewer rooms. And also it flat packs, making it very efficient to ship. So in here there are a lot of methods that we're using to lower the cost of housing. And here, this is what you would see when the plug-in house arrives. And also, the labor that's involved with building a plug-in house is very important. We're trying to make it so that anyone can build a house, and also drastically trying to reduce the time it would take for you to build one of these. So you can see these are quite light, very easy to move around. And also, we're not using any heavy equipment, so no cranes, large vehicles, and we're building these houses with really just ladders and some simple scaffolding. And a very important part of this is the way that these are put together. We're using these locks that are integrated into these panels. They're integrated when they're molded in the factories, and you're using only an Allen key to lock these together. Exploring possibilities is very important, because I think a lot of times when you're talking to policymakers in the city, things can be very abstract. And so we've worked very hard to try out a lot of different ideas on how you can add housing, improve housing in existing locations, existing communities. And so some of all these examples are from work that we've done in China. So this example is of, I guess what you'd call here a carve-out unit. So that is to take an existing house and to upgrade a portion of it and provide a separate unit with that. So you can see here, this is an old building that we didn't do anything to, and on the inside we built another house. But the inside house is very energy efficient, has a separate bathroom, and in a location that actually doesn't have a sewage system. This is in the center of historic Beijing. We've done extensions or additions. That's an example of the extension. And then we've also built these plugins inside buildings that have really in serious disrepair. And so you can imagine every city has a situation where these, there are issues with the property, with the ownership. A lot of buildings you don't really know what to do with, but are often located in very good locations. And these tend to be a very old housing stock. So we've been working hard to try to come up with creative ways of making use of this. And you can imagine, to build a house inside a structure like this would be quite difficult any other way. And of course, we've also done these detached units. We've also done ones that are on top of existing buildings. So this is an old structure, a brick structure, and here again we're working with the local government on a pilot to build an additional unit on top of the balcony. And this is to provide more rental units in this area, and you can see that there's a separate entry that's vertical circulation over there, and also houses the plumbing and sewage. And then some more developed ideas here are multi-story versions of this. This has a steel structure, but what this allows us to imagine is how what you could do with a multi-story structure, where you can actually adjust each level. So on the second floor, on the third floor, over maybe 10 years later, you can decide that you actually want to add another bedroom, or you want to take out a wing to have a larger deck. To have a system that is flexible over time, that changes as our needs change, I think is something that I definitely will try to explore more, and will be important. And lastly, engaging with stakeholders. I think a lot of times architects tend to work alone with at least our ideation process. I think for us, we get a lot out of working with a lot of different organizations. We've done two demonstrations, different demonstrations here in Boston, and we worked with a number of people. Of course, most importantly is the Housing Innovation Lab. The first demonstration we did was at Harvard Yard, and here we wanted to show how it was. Okay, that's even slower motion, but anyways. What you would see is students with no experience building anything, building a plug-in house we did in about 6 hours. So that, we'd never done that before. I mean, we were confident in our design, but we weren't entirely sure that this would go so smoothly, but it went great. But not only that, not only was it important to get people involved, have people feel like, oh, they can do something like build a house and with little experience, but also to draw people's attention to these kinds of issues with these possibilities. So we had all kinds of events and activities, many in collaboration with some of the organizations I already showed. There was dance, book readings, lots of music. We also had an exhibition inside. Artist projections. All this was part of the Harvard Arts First Festival, which gave us an opportunity to do this. So this is a housing proposal. We're dealing with housing issues, but just the idea of doing this kind of pop-up event thing to engage people at an arts festival, I think, was also something that we thought was really nice, a great opportunity. Also, we got a lot of great feedback for this. And of course, there's also the demonstration we did at City Hall, which followed what we did at Harvard. And at City Hall, we treated it a little bit differently. In this case, it was a little bit more direct in our engagement with issues surrounding housing and ADUs. We collaborated with a group called the Artists for Humanity, and so they actually sketched out what could be possible in terms of a layout on the interior. And so Marcy and we talked about this for quite a while. Well, maybe we should build it all out, or and then should we furnish it, all that kind of thing. In the end, this turned out to work really well, because when people walked in, they could still get a very good idea of how this house could be like, but it also wasn't. It didn't communicate that this was something that was set in stone. That this is something that is sketchy and is something that can be changed. And so the whole event was done in that way. Is that all of our conversation was about, okay, would this be something that would be interesting for you? How would you like to change it if there was change necessary? So I think that kind of discussion was very important. Again, we had an exhibition in here. But we also put up a lot of comments from the people that came and visited, and also had people ask questions. I mean, really, this is the work of Marcy's group, the Housing Innovation Lab, and also they organized quite a number of discussions with all kinds of different groups and stakeholders to get feedback. This is supposed to be bigger, but we had lots of media coverage, and you can imagine this all covered with the news, including Anthony's piece. Yeah, and that wraps up my my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I am going to take said moderator's prerogative and ask two questions before opening it up for questions and discussion with all of you. And my first question is about public opinion, and the second one is about Airbnb and short-term rentals. So I guess probably for Marcy and Lily, in Durango, there was a serious backlash when the city started moving ahead with both an amnesty program and then changing the rules and removing the restrictions. It got very messy. There were protests, pickets. Can't imagine anything like that happening in Boston. But do you have the sense that the concern about the lack of affordable housing in a hot market city like Boston is overtaking the concern about congestion and density and some of the old attitudes, perhaps, towards accessory dwelling units. So is one kind of overtaking the other because the affordable housing crisis is so severe? Perhaps we'll ask Newton and then Boston. And should I? Yeah, okay. So public opinion, how's
Sure.
it being greeted?
So one thing that's funny about being a planner, I think, is that it's very hard to say that there's consensus about but pretty much anything. So I think it really would depend on who you ask. And I think that there's many people in Newton who are very concerned about housing affordability, housing production, appropriate housing for seniors and families. And then there's many people who really love Newton exactly the way it is and don't foresee any change.
I think that we sort of skirted the issue a little by starting with inside the envelope of the home, because you can imagine that as you put for your legislation that you can't see the unit, so not being able to see an attic or a basement addition makes it a lot easier. But I did, when we were going out and getting community input and talking about this, I went to a community meeting. It was a neighborhood association, and one of the women, after I presented a little bit of this, she said, so someone can add a unit and our neighborhood association can't do anything about it. I was like, yeah, we just actually made it, because that was actually after we'd changed the zoning, and we'd actually made it so it skirted the neighborhood association, which, she wasn't very pleased about. And sometimes, you want to have as much community input as possible, but sometimes that community input can actually thwart the city's overarching goals of housing affordability. And so in this case, we're trying to add incremental density. Not everybody's going to be pleased about it, but hopefully it's helping the overall picture.
Yeah, and it's a start, I imagine. You had a little bit further to go in many ways, because if you want people to build that in their backyards, it's got to be allowed. All right. So, but that's down the road. All right. So the initial, this has been greeted with an open mind, and we're seeing around the country the YIMBY movement. Yes, in my backyard, a lot of recognition that. We need to increase the supply of housing and expand the range of options that are available to people. One last question, I'm going to open it up. Airbnb, short-term rentals. I know they address this in Durango, and in Newton, you have that restriction. You just can't have short-term rentals in an ADU. How do you see that playing out in Boston? I guess I'll ask everybody, maybe Chris, you could weigh in on this tension on Airbnb, which is allowing a lot of people to gain income and is in its own way producing or expanding the housing stock, and the concerns about short-term rentals for accessory dwelling units. Anybody can chime in, but yep.
I can start. Obviously, Boston has been doing a lot on short-term rentals recently. I have been thinking a lot about how this interacts with the additional dwelling unit pilot we've been working with. And I don't know if this hypothesis will be true, but I actually wonder if people will go through the hassle to create an ADU, which is a standalone separate unit, 2 egresses, has to have all the fire and safety codes met in order to short-term rental. They could just rent their existing bedroom, or not have a full built out of a new unit to do a short-term rental. So I wonder if they actually won't intersect as much as we originally thought. That's my guess so far, but we'll see.
So I guess I would just say that, so the thing about ADUs as a solution to the need for affordable housing, then obviously allowing them to be Airbnb doesn't address that, because you're not providing permanent housing. But they're also partly a solution to households who may not have the income they need to stay where they are, right? And so if there is an Airbnb option as a way to provide another source of income for households, then that could be done in pursuit of that goal. So, for example, there's a movement in West Denver. There's a neighborhood of historically African Americans, lower income, homeowner households are being affected by gentrification, looking for ways in which you can create greater financial stability for those households to be able to stay. And there's a West Denver Renaissance Collaborative that's looking at piloting ADUs, standalone separate ADUs, as a way to creating income sources for those households. In that case, it is being done in part of the means to address the need for affordable housing, but it's also fundamentally about how do we create income sources for these households. But, you know, I think if you think about Airbnb generally, there's less opposition, much less opposition in Boston's, ordinances aimed at this, is saying you can rent a bedroom out in your unit because you're not taking units off, but you're then providing a source of income for that household. So the question is, if we think about ADUs, are we doing it as a way of creating that source of income or to create affordable housing? I mean, so it's not easy.
Yeah, I think that getting to the point where we passed this ordinance in Newton, that was one of the questions that was sort of circling around in the final drafts. And I think we were able to let our counselors know that we would return to the Airbnb issue subsequently with a subsequent ordinance, but we didn't want to sort of muddy the two, and that we wanted to have this ADU ordinance really address ADUs. And I think that our purpose is similar to what you've pointed out, which is we wanted to create opportunities for homes for people who want to live in Newton, you know, on a regular basis, not as visitors to the city. So that's why the minimum rental period is part of the ordinance. Mm-hmm.
Well, it's a little bit of an awkward convergence. I mean, it's certainly more work for policy makers to figure all this out. But thinking about housing and hearing anecdotal evidence that people can put their carriage house on Airbnb and pay the mortgage. So all kinds of threads coming together. I'd like to open it up to the audience for questions and discussion. And yes, sir.
Hi, Daniel Johnston. I guess I have a question for Lily. When you were trying to pass this zoning bylaw amendment, how difficult was the conversation around not requiring parking in both the community and with politicians?
Yeah. Parking is such a big issue that we thought that it would be something that we wouldn't be able to include in the final version of the ordinance. At least that was sort of my personal prediction. We were able to have that conversation and get to the point that we did by not requiring additional parking, especially by thinking about those areas of the city in the more dense northern parts around Nonantum and Newton Corner and Newtonville. By requiring additional on-site parking, many of those places would need to create another driveway and therefore another curb cut. So essentially, you're then removing a publicly available resource of that parking space and reserving it for that one unit's use. And that simply doesn't give you net more parking. So by sort of thinking through that, we were able to craft the language the way that we did.
All right, others? Yes, thank you. And then I'll go there. Yes, here, let's see, do we have an extra mic right here? And then we'll come there.
Thanks for hosting this. This is jumping off of one of Chris's earlier points. It seems like some of those who stand to benefit the most from being able to produce this type of housing are older, low-income homeowners. Unfortunately, they often have next to zero savings or very low savings and no construction or development or certainly policy expertise. I'm curious what the panel's opinion is on the ability for developers and large private finance to partner with those people, because that seems, at least in my head, one of the only ways that this could really scale up, as opposed to 50,000 elderly homeowners trying to build one of these on their own with no experience.
In Boston, we're trying to make it as easy as possible for the average person to be able to go through the process and have a financing option for them. We've had a lot of the individuals who have come through our preliminary review have really been impressed by the expertise in the room that they're getting at a very easy manner. They don't have to do a lot of sketches or get an architect involved unless they are shown to need it, and we're working with Boston Society of Architects to try to help provide that service. There's other models I'm very interested in looking at further. Also, in New York City, they are starting a pilot, and they're hoping to have a community-based organization be a facilitator and do some of that work in advance. I would be very concerned about having developers try to get a profit off of these individuals. We did actually have in East Boston someone that immediately saw an opportunity and was going to charge $2,000 per homeowner to provide this service for them of walking them through the process. So I want to make sure that if people are jumping in to help, it's actually providing a benefit and not incurring costs for the individual.
But you raise a really important point, which is these are not cheap. So I don't know what particularly if they're exterior units. So the interior units are cheaper, but if you're talking exterior, easily $150,000, $200,000, $250,000. And so, as you say, low-income person trying to finance that, really tough. So I think as we think about this, I think Boston's trying to think about ways to do it so it's cheaper. I think lots of cities are doing standard design, so you don't have to hire an architect. There was, and I don't know enough about this, but it's intriguing that this Denver example, there was a pay-for-performance enterprise involved in kind of a shared equity model. So the idea is that investors would come in, they would put up a large chunk of the money to build the ADU, get a portion of the rental stream over a period of time, share the rental stream with the homeowner, and then after 10 or 15 years, ownership would fall entirely to the homeowner. So the investor is an equity investor that's helping to make that happen, and then getting a share in the return for a period of time. So I don't know the details, but I think that kind of model where you're thinking about not just how do we get cheap debt, because even that might make it hard to bring $200,000, but how do you do more like a shared equity kind of I think we need more innovation to make sure that we bring this into reach of the people who actually want to do it. So the fact that Newton, lots of wealthy people in Newton, most of them probably don't need an ADU. So how do you, find the ones who need it, and how do you get the capital they need to make it happen?
Yeah, and one other piece to add is that in Newton, with the existing illegal accessory units, we were able to present our federal home and CDBG funds that are offered for low-income folks to renovate their homes or provide things like ADA accessibility to their homes, to include that as something that would be used for upgrading those illegal ones, or I think even making new accessory units. I'm unaware whether those have been tapped into yet, but it is a financing stream for those situations.
James, as you noted, you're actually trying to keep those costs down. Is there a range, can you remind us, for the plug-in house prototype that maybe could get the costs down a little bit?
Yeah, well, construction costs also vary according to cities, of course. But what Chris mentioned around, on the very low end, actually, I'd say 200,000, and the high end, 300,000. And I think the difference, you could say, like in Portland, you can do it for around 200,000, maybe slightly less. But then I think in Boston would be considerably more expensive, or Vancouver is a lot more expensive. I think Vancouver has also the ADU building there has been quite high. But what we would try to do is actually I think we can cut that to between a third to a half. And I think a big part of that I think we can benefit a lot from people building their own, being more involved with that. So you can either be involved with building your house, or you can be the general contractor. So you're in charge of the project, but then you could go and subcontract out other jobs. And I think that could also decrease a lot of costs. And also cities are, we heard a little bit about standardized designs, or pre-approved designs, or design guidelines. I think we can embed a lot of those ideas into the product itself. So you can only, you wouldn't worry about people building them in ways where you would have issues with safety. And currently, if you come up with a guideline, that's really also just a set of drawings, right? That you would then have to give to a builder that would then execute the project. But with a system that's modular, that flexibility would already be built into it again. So you can adjust it, but you wouldn't have to build it from scratch. A lot of the components are already there. So I think that's why I also think it's really important to work with cities to make sure that with the development of the product itself, you're already considering a lot of the things that the city is interested in providing. I think also housing for the aging. There are a lot of needs that people have, accessibility needs. That also can be integrated into houses. So you imagine if you're trying to retrofit an existing house, or a lot of houses that are newly built wouldn't often take these things into these ideas into consideration, and they're very expensive. An ADU can be designed from scratch to be oriented for this population. And one of the great things about ADUs is they're often on the ground. Right, so it just kind of fits perfectly with the need that's out there.
Okay, great. I promise, yes.
Hi, Sharon Day, and I recently built a tiny house, a movable tiny house. And so I'm curious about a couple of things. First of all, I guess for the city of Newton, what was the discussion or thinking about the minimum square footage at 250? Because of course then that cuts out the possibility of tiny houses. And if any or all want to make any kind of comments about the 2018 International Residential Code, which adopted an appendix for tiny houses. Curious what discussion or thinking there is about that as a viable option for the 15 or so thousand people who have already built them and tucked them away in places mostly illegal. Seems worth discussing.
Yeah, great question. I think that was actually one of the biggest ideas that came into people's minds as we were talking with residents, sort of interested in this idea is, oh, does that mean I could make a tiny house on my lot? And that's sort of the image that people conjure up. I can't say, any better reason of why that number was selected other than I think people that some of the issues about regulating tiny houses, especially movable tiny houses, are slightly different than with ADUs. And so I think, sort of like with the Airbnb example we were just talking about, we really wanted to try and focus this ordinance on ADUs and make sure we did it properly and get it passed, and then return to, so for example, a tiny house ordinance subsequently. Mm-hmm.
I should point out that 250 square feet is actually pretty low for other communities considering these kinds of changes. So it's radical over there in Newton. You went pretty low.
I'll just add one comment. I've been wondering about when we hopefully expand in the future to backyard homes, how that might impact the cost of those homes. So you can imagine with attic and basement units, they'll come in naturally below market. But what if you have this very quaint, cute backyard unit? It might actually command quite a high rent in a neighborhood where there's a lot of mixed-use housing or a lot of apartments and condos. So tiny houses in which this kind of flipped it on the head for me, thinking about what if somebody was actually renting their backyard to someone who owns a tiny house, and then it's a low-income opportunity, a new kind of starter home where someone can get into home ownership without having to own the land, and they can have a tiny house in someone's backyard. So I'm very interested in that model as we think about expanding to backyards.
Here. Hi, my name is Ganesh Ramachandran. I live in Natick, Massachusetts, and I'm a member of the board of the Natick Affordable Housing Trust Fund, and I chaired a committee to explore tiny homes or smaller homes within the part of the town fabric. The first recommendation I made was to change the name from tiny houses to small homes, because tiny houses have been so synonymous with these boxes on top of trailers. One comment I want to make is a lot of these towns have a fair bit of non-conforming lots, and opening up those lots for development would be a great opportunity for these plug-in homes. And I had a question for Shen, like, how resilient are these, like, in terms of floods, or have you tested in wind tunnels and gale forces? So I'm curious to know about that.
Yeah, I think many cities have very unique lots that are often hard to build on, and Marcia and I also talked about that as well. And I think one of the points I wanted to try to make with the plug-in house is that we can customize it. We can customize it fairly easily to fit in very different locations, but still mass produce it. So that's usually you think of mass production, prefab, whatnot, as the same thing over and over again. But in fact, today there are a lot of ways to go about things where you don't have to sacrifice a unique design because people's backyards are going to be all slightly different, if not very different, right? I mean, some people would want your entryway to be on one side, others you want to orient it another way. So I think that's essential, and I think that's part of the reason why prefab hasn't been able to take off as much. And the other question in terms of resilience, well, we're also protected by that from just building codes. So for me to be able to provide this as a house, it needs to go through very intense testing and certification. And those building codes sometimes vary. For example, California has, of course, high seismic requirements. But any kind of building product that you would see on the market should be fine with that. But actually, for us, because we're manufacturing this in a factory, pretty much anything that's manufactured in a factory can reach higher standards of quality because of the scale and the efficiencies in there. And also the materials that we're using. So it seems a little strange that you can provide a higher quality product for less price. But if you take a chair like this chair I'm sure doesn't cost very much. But if I were to have a carpenter build a chair out of wood, right, it would be much more expensive. You're just able to use better materials because you have the quantity. And so, for example, the insulation I'm using is structural. The insulation that you would find mostly everywhere, especially in housing, would be it's mostly bat insulation, right? So bat insulation is probably a third as efficient as what we have, and also our insulation is impervious to water. So some cities like New Orleans, I think they require you have to use polyurethane. So again, when you go to industrial technologies, you can take advantage of much better materials.
All right, here, yes, please, right up front here, and then I'll go over there. If you want to just wait for the microphone, there you go.
So my question was, I recently moved to Boston, and I was thinking I'd be living in this tiny 150 square foot odd apartment, but surprisingly there aren't that many, and I ended up living in an 800 square foot apartment in East Boston. The thing I wanted to ask you is there a push on, especially to Ms. Marcy, is there a push on tiny apartments in the city in a high-rise building? And I know 150 square feet sounds like a tiny box, but then most of us just go there to crash at night, and we don't need a living room because I don't have anybody to come into that living room. So I'd rather have a community living room and a community gym and a community pool. So, and if you would allow for a 150 square foot development, you could probably have a higher FAR just because it's providing that much more affordable housing. So is there a push in that regard?
So that's a great question. There were a lot more smaller units in cities like Boston decades ago, and there were some challenges with those. Safety, they started to regulate a lot more, and now there's a trend back towards smaller living, and cities around the country are looking at increasing density and adding affordability by having smaller micro units, or the term we're using is compact living. And we did a similar initiative of the plug-in house where we brought a small unit around the city and asked people what they thought. Would they live in a smaller unit?
It wasn't 150, it was 385, so tiny housers, you might not think of that as small. And then we've also done a competition trying to think about feasibility. So now we're close to having a set of guidelines that would allow developers to build smaller units in Boston. What's governing the minimum right now is actually the building code, which is a lot more difficult to change. And that's what Sharon was mentioning. There's been some movement to try to reduce the sizes there as well. So I think you'll be seeing in the next year more changes there in Boston. I don't know if you want to talk about trends, no? Okay.
Yes, ma'am. Right back here.
Hi, this is great. I'm Emily Cooper. I'm with the Massachusetts Executive Office of Elder Affairs, and so we spend a fair amount of time talking to older adults and older homeowners and talking about ADUs and things like that. The one thing that hasn't come up, which is not structural or zoning, and I'd be interested to hear if it's come up with you, is that folks don't want to be landlords. So they live in their house and they haven't sold it, and they're a little reluctant. They want to stay in their community, but maybe you can convince them to go to the carriage house or the nice ADU you made in the backyard. But then they become landlords of the people who are living in the main house, and that's the last thing they want to do. Or they sell it, right, because it has to be owner-occupied, and now they're a tenant, and they're incredibly fearful that the landlord someday is going to say you're going to have to leave. So it's really a mindset more than like if I had a magic wand and all the structural and zoning and all the other things went away. There's a fair amount of people that just don't want to be landlords. I know there's a bunch that do, but have there been any ordinances either in Newton or in Boston or in other places that have looked at kind of if you did something like you sold the main house to the elder homeowner sold the house, became a tenant, and could have some safeguards that they could live there kind of in perpetuity, or something in their lease that made it so that they didn't have to leave, that might make it a more palatable. Has that come up anywhere?
I've heard about interest in this kind of idea from community land trusts in Boston. That would be a safeguard way for the existing resident to remain on the property and know that they have a stake, but also that it can stay affordable in perpetuity. I don't think they've had much success yet, but I'd be very interested to talk to you after. This is how ideas are made right here. And figuring out ways to help that population take advantage of something like this.
Yeah, I think that some of the issues that you mentioned about being a landlord are also some of the reasons why at the end of my presentation I said, it's just not for everyone. Partly it's the cost, partly it's just the idea of living in close quarters with people that you may not know. I think that we often see folks that would like to see this as a multi-generational or an intergenerational housing option for, maybe let's say their kids and their grandkids to move into the larger house and they move into the smaller house. But it's also, really just a matter of the amount of housing units that are available in a place like Newton, because we haven't been producing new units and we haven't been producing smaller units for many years. Most people who are older are faced with staying in their home or moving out of Newton. And I think that that's sort of part of the broader narrative. People really want to stay. Some people age in place on their property, and other people really just want to find a place to live in a different type of unit in Newton. That's a different conversation, though.
Get on board of that with a different type of mindset, then a lot of different possibilities open up. So like ideas like co-living, shared spaces, different ways of subdividing up lots and things like that. I think if there's a will, then there's a lot of opportunity there. But how do you get there, I think, has a lot to do with people's imaginations, right? I mean, how can you imagine something that you haven't seen before? And luckily, that's where I think designers can help with the situation, is that we can help imagine things and we can help try them out. I think it's the worst is when we're perceived as forcing an idea on the ground, and there's a lot of investment that ends up people start to speculate a lot about what will come about from this development. And by the time this is actually built, it's many years later, and you can't learn from that process. So I think something about ADUs is very promising with that, and also meeting cities like Newton and Boston that are experimenting, and they're actually policy making is actually a design process. So I think more of that would really help with with pushing these ideas forward.
Okay. Well, I promised over here, yes, if you'd like to pose a question.
Hi. So to continue, James, what you were saying, what's kind of next for the plug-in house? Is this something that you are working on getting whatever kind of like code approvals in the U.S. and soon it'll be available for people to buy and build themselves? Is it only going to be available through your architecture firm and kind of more of something between a bespoke and a prefab, or what are you kind of like? What's the future of the plug-in house?
Well, I've been exploring how architects can be more effective, and I think partially we have to take a more of a role in pushing our ideas out, to not just stop with having a design, but also figure out how it would be financed, scaled, and also how it's directed towards important social issues that we hope to be more influential in. So part of it is to be more entrepreneurial, and because of that, I'm also confronted with a lot of regulatory issues that I wouldn't normally perceive. So because this is a new material, it's a new structural system. You don't usually come up with different materials. You have wood stud, metal stud, concrete, and that's kind of it. And there's a reason for that, because it's very difficult to go through that process of testing and getting it certified. So I'd actually I'm thinking of doing a little bit more research on this to help make this process a little bit more visible, and to see within that if there's something that can be done to simplify it. Just like how you'd have to go through an approval process on the local level. Building codes are on a national level. These certification bodies. I remember I spoke with Lily earlier on, just scratching my head. How the heck do you do this? And now I have a better idea. And actually, just was talking to Chris just a little bit earlier about maybe putting some time into understanding this. And I think that would be interesting, and I think then this would be something that a lot of people can learn from. And then also just this thing about being entrepreneurial. You have a lot of talk about people, their startups all over the place. There are more people interested in issues around social impact. So not only profit-driven ventures, but driven by the effect of these businesses on communities, on your environment, and looking at new ways of financing these kinds of ventures. I think there's a lot of new interest in this, a lot of support for this. Also with financing for this, I think. National organizations like Fannie Mae, I think Enterprise Community Partners is also they've been thinking about financing projects like this. Yeah? Yes. So, interested for sure. Yeah, if we can bring together a lot of these components, the financing, the manufacturing, some of the policy, and we can talk amongst each other more closely, then instead of having these separate silos going about things as we usually do, I think we would have a better chance at improving some of our situations.
Well, you've definitely started the conversation. Yes, how about the last word?
I don't need a microphone. I'm Tracy Powell. I built a tiny house in collaboration with BSA 3 years ago, and I've been living in it ever since. And I'm with the American Tiny House Association. My question always is, we were really careful at the BSA to build something that had fire-rated walls and fire-tested walls with sprinklers and 2 means of egress out of the space, and I've yet to see that anywhere in the ADU world or the tiny house world, those same provisions for fire separation. I'm just wondering if the fire marshal for the state's been engaged with the ADU and also with the individual living units that we're talking about.
It actually has been a big part of the conversation. So our key partner from the city has been the Inspectional Services Department, and we've been working closely with them and the fire department. Even in this plug-in house, you can't see in this picture, but we were required to put in 2 doors, even though it was just a demonstration unit, just to be sure that there was safe access in and out of the unit. And then for the actual units that are being permitted, they have to have 2 means of egress. If it's going from a 2 to a 3 or a 3 to a 4, we're requiring that they add a sprinkler and hardwire fire alarm system in all of the units. So this is a big component. It's very important in terms of safety, but it also is adding a lot of cost, which is why then the loan product that we want to offer is hopefully going to help mitigate some of that extra cost.
Yeah, I would say the same is true for Newton. One of our key partners was Inspectional Services, and they're sort of, now that this ordinance is passed, they're the ones that carry it forward as people come forward for permits. And in preparing for this, I asked them if there were any cases where the permits were denied, or where it was permitted, but then before they got the certificate of occupancy upon inspection, if it was not given the certificate of occupancy. And I think that was one of the only reasons was about the fire separation, which has to be the same as it would between any other unit, let's say in a townhome side-by-side unit, so you'd have to have the same fire separation. And unfortunately, what James was mentioning a moment ago is that we actually looked at finding ways to somewhat sort of play matchmaker between homeowners who would be interested in his product, with our new ordinance as it had just come online. And we had a lot of preliminary conversations, and I think although there was interest, from what I understand, doesn't meet that fire separation requirement yet, this material. So in terms of actually having it be a house that's resided in, that's sort of one final hurdle to close the circle on all of this. So the fire separation is sort of a big barrier in terms of the permitting.
Yeah, I can speak to this a little bit. I think one thing that can help architects a lot is actually my discussions with both Marcy and Lily were fantastic, because the Commissioner of Inspectional Services were present in both situations. The fire chief was present, so I can get difficult questions answered by people that really know their stuff. So because codes are based off of what's already existing, right? Now, if you're trying to innovate, you're trying to come up with something new, you're going to also have to adjust the codes to meet that, and the process for that is a lot of testing, and it gets certified by these larger organizations. That is not something that a lot of people are familiar with, right? I mean, even the Commissioner for Inspectional Services will not deal with how you would actually go and test a product and so on. So in order for them to use a product, they need to feel confident that it's safe. And so you need to demonstrate that, right? So I think with that process, there's a lot of opportunity to do a lot of work. We can also, I think there are ways of simplifying these processes. Like, for example, I think fire alarms are needed, but not always. And there could be situations where, because there's a different use in a different type of context, where it's okay not to have that, right? I mean, these kinds of situations are coming up all the time. It's just that how can we go through this process a little bit more efficiently and update it?
It sounds good. A lot of flexibility, sounds like, is the order of the day. After all, the safety, fire, resilience, all very important issues, but the fire departments of this country is what gave us minimum street widths in conventional suburban development. So thinking a little bit more flexibly sounds like a good idea. I think we can wrap it up, or continue the conversation, I should say, over drinks and refreshments. And please join me in thanking our panelists for a great conversation today.